This video is 6.1 to 6.3. This is all about loops, that is some form of repetition. We're doing the same thing over and over and over again. So what we're going to start with is the type of loop that's called a while loop. Okay, and it runs while, generally while something is not true. You can run while something is not false, but that's a little harder to do. So real quick, let's just redo this. There, now you should be awake. So, this is page 228. A while statement executes a block of code repeatedly. A condition controls how often the loop is executed. So, sort of like an if statement, except the syntax is while condition, do something. Now, the trick is that your condition has to update. Something has to be checked, and it has to change, otherwise this gets hung in an infinite loop and never changes. So let's just say we wanted to do some sort of incrementing of adding interest while my bank account was less than some target. And then I would just increment some sort of counter called years. Every time I ran through it, would assume it'd be a new year. And then, update some rate, interest rate. And then keep updating, increasing my balance until I hit my target, at which point the loop will kick out. Because this runs while true. It cycles through, comes back up, checks your condition again. If it's still true, goes through again. As soon as it's false, it kicks out, and your code continues with whatever was next. So let's look at the investment viewer. So the runner is pretty simple. I just start with an initial balance of 10,000 and interest rate of 5%. Create a new investment object. Set my initial balance and the rate. And I call invest, and I wait for balance 2 times my initial balance. So I'm going for 20. And then I tell you how many years it's going to take to get there. So investment doubled after years time. So how does it all work? Wrong one. Alright, so 3 instance fields, balance, rate, and my years. Looks very similar to a bank account. Right, public investment, double balance, double rate. So rate and balance get set. Years obviously starts at 0. Alright, wait for balance, give me my target while my current balance is less than the target parameter. Add 1 to my year, I gotta wait 1 more year, add the interest, and then go back and check again. If my balance is still less than my target balance, increment years again, do it all over again. As soon as my balance exceeds my target balance, it stops, which ways it returns to the main program, and then the next step is to get balance if I wanted it, or get years, so this returns however many years up here that I was incrementing every time 1 more year went by. So at 5% interest, 15 years to double it from $10,000 to $20,000. So that is a while loop. Pretty straightforward. So self-check number 1, how often is the following statement in the loop executed? And the statement being while in hard code written, while false, well, that'll obviously never run because this instantly evaluates to false. It doesn't even do anything once. The next question says, what would happen if the rate field was set to 0 in the main method investment runner? Well, if my rate is 0, then it never goes up, so it's just going to infinitely loop over and over and over and over and over again because the balance never increases, therefore it never changes, therefore your condition never becomes false. So that's in common error 6.1 on page 232. The most annoying loop error is an infinite loop. That is a loop that runs forever and cannot be stopped. So as it says, a common reason for infinite loops is forgetting to advance the variable. So if I had int years equals 0 while years is less than 20, add interest to my balance, but I never changed my years, that's never going to stop running. Common error is what's called an off by one. It's a common error with programming loops. So you're going to go through test cases. That is, off by one means you either go one time too many, or you stop one time too soon where you meant to go. And that's often by either, do I start my counter at 0? Do I start count at 1? How often do I increment? How often do I stop? And then in my conditions, is it just less than some target? Or do I need to go less than or equal to my target? Because, the difference between both of these is generally one cycle through the loop as to how off you're going to be. So those are off by one errors. Those are really tricky. All right, the next form of a loop that we're going to look at, this is section 6.2, is what's called a for loop. Okay? Just a very fancy while loop, but it's some start while I'm going to increment one time in the loop, one time less than or equal to some ending time. All right, they're going to compile it into something a little shorter. So do something and always add sequence one more time for I. So while that is a shorter way of writing it, it's a for loop, and you're going to do everything all in one line. So you're going to go for initialize I, 0 start, whatever. I is less than end, semicolon, I plus plus. It's very important to put semicolons there. Commas won't evaluate. So this is a shorthand way of writing all of this over here. Now I can initialize I outside and then use it again. If I initialize it like this, which is pretty common, it's only good for the loop. There's my condition, there's my condition, and then remember at the end of a loop I have to increment my condition somehow, and I just automatically get to write it in there. That says every time at the end, the last thing you do every time you run through a for loop is you increment your counter by 1. Okay. So you're going to use a for loop when a variable runs from a starting to an ending value with constant increment or decrement. I could go the other way. Instead of I plus plus, I could go I minus minus, in which case it wouldn't start at I. Maybe I say I equals 10, while I is greater than 0, run it and subtract. Okay. So let's look at the investment runner on page 239, but let's look at it as a for loop. Interesting to take the tutorial and not have it work, right? Well, let's open that. The runner is essentially the same, except instead of telling it to go to a double, I'm just telling it to wait a number of years. And then let's go in and see what the problem is. All right, double balance rate years. My constructor is going to be the same. Public void wait for balance. So while my balance is exactly the same, and then wait years, I give you a number of years. All right, for int I, because number of years, double balance, years equals years plus n. Yeah, I wouldn't be able to find n. That's interesting. Years, let's keep continuing to get number of years, param number of years to wait. Probably supposed to be, well, I is not going to work either. Oh, it's probably not going to, it wouldn't like I outside there either, right? Yeah. So obviously I just waited the number of years I was supposed to wait. That should work. Alright, so after 20 years my balance is 26,532. 26,532.98, yep. And okay, yeah, so they just said int n in the tutorial, and then in the book, and then but your parameter was n, where our parameter had been changed a number of years, so that was correct to change that. Alright, so that's a for loop. Okay. Now if you look at self-check number 4 on page 241, the question is how many times does the following loop execute? Well, I start at 0, I go less than or equal to 10, and I increment I every time. Alright, and I just print the square of I. However, this is going to run a grand total of 11 times. The reason being is because I start at 0 and I stop when I'm less than or equal to 10. So I go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, which is 10 loops through, and then I got to go 10. So if I only wanted to print the first 10 numbers, I should either start I at 1 or or my condition should be, well, I is less than 10. Generally, often like equal 0 goes with like a less than. If I start out like a 1, then I'll go something like less than or equal to. Okay. So common error is 6.4, page 242. Sum 0 for I equals 1. I is less than or equal to 10, I plus plus. And notice there's a semicolon there. It's easy to type because you always get in the habit of typing a semicolon. What's going to happen? Well, it's supposed to add them all up, right? But it's only going to print 11 because when I gets down at 10, it's going to add 10 to the sum. Because that semicolon says don't do anything, because a for loop, is very much like an if statement in that, remember, for an if statement, if I don't put no curly braces, it runs the first line only, right? Always it'll run the first line of a if statement. Same thing with a for loop. No braces means it's just going to run the first line. Well, the problem with that is if my first line is, as far as the computer is concerned, is a semicolon, well, it runs that 10 times and then keeps going. So that'd obviously be a big problem. Now 6.3, nested loops. Just like I can have multiple conditions inside of their own conditions, I can nest if statements, I can nest loops. So run one loop. For every time that loop runs, the other loop runs its entirety. So let's look at this drawing a triangle thing. If I wanted to draw a triangle on page 245, the actual picture of the output would be on page 246. For every column I go down, I have to print that many rows of little blocks. So if you look at the for loop for that, let's go open that up. Alright. So I'm going to give you some width up here. So the user tells you how wide I want this base. Okay, I save that in my instance field. So that's going to be my loop condition. While I'm less than or equal to that width value, because I'm starting at 1, I'm going to make each triangle row. So the first time, this is 1. I want 1 square. So I come in here and do another loop that says int j, a new counter, equals 1. J is less than I, increment j, and every time concatenate my string with another block. And then when that loop is done running, so for instance, let's say I'm on the 4th row, I'm going to make 4 blocks because I as j loops till it's less than I. Then I'm going to add a new line at the end of my string, and then this is the end of my loop. So then I go back up and I check my condition again. So I has now gone up from 1 to 2. Is I less than my width? Well, not if my width is, let's say my width was, we're at width 4, let's say its width was supposed to be 5. So now I is 5. I'm less than or equal to width. I come back in here. I start at 1 again. I loop less than width, so less than 5 times. I make 5 new blocks. This for loop right here finishes. I append a new line to it. Now the very last thing it does before it goes back up again, remember, is it increments my count variable. So now I is 5. Comes up here, or sorry, I was 5. Now I is 6. It fails on my condition I is less than or equal to width, which was only 5. So it kicks out, it's done. And then the last statement is to take that string I just made and return it. So for every time this block statement runs once, this little loop runs to its entirety. Then it comes back up and this loop goes again. This loop runs the entire time and goes back, and this loop runs the entire time. So let's just see what the triangle runner is doing. So first I'm going to try to make a triangle of 3 and a triangle of 15. So triangle of 3, triangle of 15. And I can make one as big as I wanted.